Hey everyone, and welcome to Seriously Risky Business. This is our podcast all about cybersecurity policy and intelligence. And my name is Amberleigh Jack. And in just a moment, I'll be joined by Tom Uren, our policy and intelligence editor, to chat about the Seriously Risky Business newsletter from this week that you can, of course, read and subscribe to from our website, risky.biz. First, though, I'd like to thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for supporting Tom's work, and also Lawfare, who syndicate Tom's newsletter and publish it on the Lawfare Media website. And finally, thanks to our corporate sponsor this week, Kroll. So g'day, Tom. Thanks for joining me.
G'day, Amberleigh. How are you?
Oh, not too bad. And got a couple of things I want to chat to you about today. You've got a few pieces in the newsletter. And the first one is you've touched on a report that looks at 3 Russian security companies and their relationship with their government, especially since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And reading your piece this morning, it seems, Tom, it turns out that those sort of strengthening ties with the government have paid off pretty well when it comes to choosing sides for these security firms.
Yeah. So the premise of the report is let's look at what's gone on in the Russian private sector cyber environment. And the way it approaches that is by looking at 3 particular companies. So they're Kaspersky, which is very well known, Positive Technologies, that has been sanctioned by the US prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and so has some notoriety. It provides offensive and defensive services to the Russian government and other customers. And also Code Security, which is mostly, it seems like, a defensive play. So network security, not involved in offensive activity at all, it appears. And the sort of idea of the report is let's look at these companies because they'll tell us more about the risks to, US and Western interests. Now, I think that's interesting. What I found most fascinating about the report is that these companies have actually done really well since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so the US has taken some steps to try and, I guess, isolate or punish them in a way. So it's sanctioned each of these companies over time. Like I said, Positive Technologies before the invasion of Ukraine and the other 2 afterwards. And it's also, when it comes to Kaspersky, it's basically booted it out of the country. And there have been a couple of other countries that have followed suit to some degree. But despite all that, all 3 of them, they've had record profits in the last year. And to me, it seemed like the real message of the report is that it actually pays to pick sides. So prior to, I don't know, maybe 2020 or so, Kaspersky was a global company. It was trying to sell all over the world. And in a way, it tried to isolate itself from being associated with the Russian government. And it turns out that there's been this big controversy about the allegation is that Kaspersky was actually acting as a tool of the Russian government and that it was focusing its endpoint security products to try and collect intelligence on US programs. So that's obviously tremendously bad for business. And
well, you'd think so, right?
You would think so, right? But in fact, it's just adapted. And there's this sort of polarization dynamic, it seems, where if you align yourself strongly with the Russian government, you all of a sudden have a whole lot of potential friends who are skeptical of the US and US companies. And so it's not we're not in the global market, we're losing. It's we're in a different kind of market where we have a different kind of marketing pitch, where our pitch is we're not the US, and therefore you can trust us. Now that dynamic also played out for Positive Technologies, which also has an international business, and their pitch, it seemed to me, it was we're a diversity play. So you may have a US vendor, you may have an Israeli vendor, you may have a Chinese vendor. Why not have a Russian vendor as well? And that, in a way, isolates you from geopolitical risk. Not isolates you, but it diversifies your geopolitical risk. So if all of a sudden your country is no longer friends with the US or with China or with Israel, whatever, there's another place that you can have business with. And so these pitches have been successful for these companies. It speaks about how Kaspersky's done relatively well expanding. It's mitigated concerns by setting up data centers overseas. Now, it's easy for us to be skeptical about all those fixes, but from a financial and a marketing point of view, they absolutely work.
Yeah, for sure. And this is quite an interesting case study because obviously Russia's at war and tensions are high and the pressure's really on. But you also make the point in your newsletter, Tom, that this isn't a unique thing for Russia. Security firms working with government or having ties with government, that's kind of just a sign of the times.
Yeah. So thinking back, and this report made me think back about how the sort of positioning of firms has changed over time. So maybe going back 10 years, you would think that, yes, there can be such a thing as a global cybersecurity firm. It only does cybersecurity, but it'll serve markets all over the world. And this report really made me think about when the chips are down, companies naturally get involved with their own governments. The people, I think, there's both cultural, like heritage and patriotic reasons that you would support your own nation, but also financial reasons. And that's because governments tend to be, like, they can have very lucrative contracts. So there's reasons that you tend to move closer to your host government. And when there's geopolitical competition, when there's people talk about great power competition, it's natural that cybersecurity companies are intimately involved in governments because both cyber espionage, cybersecurity, and it's a way of projecting power. And so it's intimately connected to the interests of the state. So it seems to me it's a natural consequence of increasing competition that cybersecurity firms are drawn closer to their host countries. So now it seems like a natural state in a way that yes, you're not just a cybersecurity firm, you're a Russian cybersecurity firm or a Chinese one or a US one. And the war is, I guess, it sort of clarifies that. It makes it clear, it shines a spotlight on how much those interests align when the chips are really down and when the pressure's on. I think that's probably a reality that most people recognize now in the industry, but it's not talked about all that much.
So I want to move on to the next story, Tom, but sticking with Russia. And you've written today, I love the headline, actually, Russia is shooting the messengers. And you've written about how Russia is forcing its citizens off foreign messenger apps, like WhatsApp, and moving them towards the Russian national messenger Max, which is fairly new, but is very much being encouraged by the Russian government. So talk me through this one.
Yeah, so the story is that in the last, since the beginning of the month, there have been reports that WhatsApp and Telegram voice and video calls of the service is not working very well. And it turns out that the reason is that the Russian government is just blocking it. So it's not blocking everything, but it's degrading service, and it's all part of I guess you'd call it a dastardly master plan to promote a particular app called Max. So I know you spoke about it on the main show a few weeks ago. It's intended to be an all-in-one app. It's relatively new. It's created by a Russian company VK, which is effectively state control.
Yeah.
So rather than relying on the market and building a really good app, like the Russian government has decided, well, we'll just guarantee success by making sure that nothing else works. Now, it turns out there's reporting that the degrading of voice and video calls is actually a compromised position. So one of the steps that they considered taking was just blocking everything, not just voice and video, but texts and all kinds of messages. The caring Russian government decided that was just a step too far, but they haven't ruled it out. So I expect that when you've got that kind of stick as an option and you're prepared to use it, you have the political will to just block everything else. Well, of course, the only messenger app left is going to be the one that you allow. And so there's no sign that that's going to dissuade them. Now, if you've got an app that does everything and you force your population onto it, I think that's a very nice position for the Russian government to be in, from both the surveillance and information and propaganda control perspective. So they seem to have both the motivation, and I guess now they have the pieces in place, in that there is an app that exists that they can, in Silicon Valley parlance, they would take this minimum viable product and they would actually make it work well. I guess for the Russian population, it'd be nice if it was a working app that was actually effective and did its job. But when you've got the stick of no other apps will work, well, of course, it's going to be a success.
Yeah, exactly.
Air quotes.
When I first started looking into this a few weeks ago, and my first thought was, when you compare it to something like China's WeChat, that was a long time ago that was made, and things were a bit different, and it was maybe easier to kind of slowly integrate that into everyday life, so it became this everything app. And it felt like now it would be a really hard time to bring something out and knock everything else out. But I guess if you just make nothing else work,
yeah, that's right,
and you give no one else a choice.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the way the Chinese apps developed was organically, and it was organic because they were behind the Great Firewall, and so there was space for, I guess, Chinese domestic innovation, whereas this is very much a government-directed project, which, I guess historically you'd be skeptical that government-directed projects will work, but when you have let's just switch everything else off, that seems like a very powerful motivator to adopt this app. I mean, they're doing other things like pre-installing it on all new devices and migrating government communications from things like Telegram to Macs. Like, those are pretty small carrots. I think the big stick is the most effective thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the meantime, this is having a very real impact on Russian citizens as well.
I quote I refer to a story where from Medusa, which is a Russian a media outlet focused on Russia, and it just collates all these stories of people whose lives has been disrupted in a real way because they can't contact. Typically, it's elderly people or remote workers, people who've got no other choice, and when they've been cut off, it's hard to talk through with your grandparents how to install a particularly new app and get it working. They're used to WhatsApp, that kind of story. Sad.
Yeah, for sure. And finally, Tom, over to the West now. And recent reporting this week has made it seem like the UK's kind of backed down on this demand that they made in January for Apple to provide a backdoor to allow them access to iCloud data. But I'm a little confused as to exactly what's changed here. So can you tell me about it, Tom?
Yeah, so this story, I think it's just like, from a UK government point of view, it's just a mess. And so the original reporting, going back to February, was that the UK had issued a secret government order called a Technical Capability Notice. And that notice went to Apple, and it said, according to the reporting, please provide us with the capability to access iCloud backups, full stop. And so the reporting, which came out in the Washington Post, was the UK government's asking for access to backdoor access to anything anywhere in the world that's in iCloud. So that's the report. Like people complain, or I think rightfully say, it's not a backdoor in the sense that for most people, there already is access to iCloud. So there's a service that will protect you from Apple and from law enforcement called Apple Advanced Data Protection. Mm-hmm. So ADP is not rolled out by default, but it makes the keys only available to the user. And so Apple would be locked out, and therefore a law enforcement legal request would be locked out. So the UK government was essentially saying, just make sure that you don't roll this out too widely in a way that we can't get access. And so it's trying to hold the line or maintain the status quo. But anyway, the framing of that reporting got an immediate response from US government officials, including the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Mm-hmm. She spoke about being greatly concerned. A number of US senators also agreed. In fact, President Trump said, in an interview with The Spectator, said this is, like something you'd hear out of China. And so from a UK government point of view, this is a cluster. We don't want this. Things are a bit tricky with US-UK relations. The last thing we want is for our lawful intercept capability, which is a nice to have, like that's a good thing to have, to upset international relations with the US. So now the story is Gabbard said that the UK had backed off, and she used very specific wording, which I think was interesting. The UK has agreed to drop its mandate for Apple to provide a backdoor that would have enabled access to the protected encrypted data of American citizens and encroached on our civil liberties. And so I think it's interesting that she's really carved off American citizens. Like, she doesn't care about other citizens, Australians, UK, whatever. And so that makes me wonder what's really going on. So there's other reporting where it talks about British officials saying the clash has been resolved. The issue was settled. One person described the UK as having caved to US pressure, and another official said, we can't and we won't make Apple break its encryption. Now, that all sounds like, at first reading, like a back down. But what happened is that Apple said, okay, we're not going to comply entirely with the order, but for UK citizens, we're going to essentially switch off advanced data protection. So if you're in the UK, your iCloud backups can't be encrypted in the same way. They have other sorts of encryption, but not encryption that's protected from Apple having the key, essentially. And so that seems to me like, well, like maybe there's just a compromise position reached, which is effectively that, no, you don't get unencrypted or access to iCloud backups for everyone, but you get access to iCloud backups for UK people.
Yeah.
And that protects US citizens, like, whatever. You can do whatever with your own citizens. So I think the whole story is like just kind of a failure of diplomacy, I think. Like, I think the UK probably stumbled into this without understanding the implications for the broader relationship. So regardless of what the actual outcome is, I'm sure everyone's just happy it's over.
Yeah, 100%. Hey, Tom, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to chatting to you again next week.
Thanks, Amberleigh.